The smell of mildew never really leaves you. Even now, surrounded by Italian marble and cathedral ceilings, I sometimes wake up thinking I'm back there, on that lumpy pull-out couch, staring up at exposed pipes, listening to my family laugh, above me while I tried to ignore the occasional skittering of mice across the concrete floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 15 years, that basement was my designated spot during every family reunion. Not because we lacked space, not because I arrived late, but because in the unspoken hierarchy of the Walsh family, I was always the one who mattered least. Until the day they pulled up to my lake house and realized exactly who they'd been overlooking all those years. My earliest memory of understanding my place in the family was my 10th birthday. Our house in Lakeside, Connecticut wasn't particularly grand, but it was spacious enough. A colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch that my father Thomas had restored himself. 4 bedrooms upstairs, a finished attic, and that dreaded basement. More than enough room for our family of 5. I remember running down the stairs that morning, expecting the usual birthday pancakes with candles that Mom made for Mark and Danielle. Instead, I found the kitchen empty except for a hastily scribbled note on the counter. Had to take Mark to his baseball tournament, cereal in the pantry, back for dinner. Mom. I ate my Cheerios alone, trying not to cry. When they finally returned that evening, Mark was clutching a trophy, and everyone was too busy celebrating his win to remember it was my birthday until I quietly mentioned it during dinner. Oh! My mother Carol's hand flew to her mouth. Jessica, honey, I completely forgot. We'll do something special tomorrow, okay? We never did. That was my life in the Walsh family. My older brother Mark was the golden child, athletic, charming, destined for medical greatness from the moment he could hold a toy stethoscope. My younger sister Danielle was the beauty, the social butterfly whose every accomplishment from dance recitals to homecoming court was documented, framed, and displayed prominently on our living room walls. And me? I was the middle child, the steady one, the one who never caused trouble, which was code for the one we don't have to think about. My good grades were expected, not celebrated. My artistic talents were nice hobbies, rather than gifts to be nurtured. When I won the state math competition in 8th grade, my father nodded and said, "Good job," before immediately turning the conversation to Mark's college prospects. But it was during the annual Walsh family reunions that my position became most painfully clear. The reunions were a tradition that stretched back to my grandparents' time. Every summer, relatives from across the East Coast would descend on our home for a week of cookouts, board games, and reminiscing. As the host family, we were in charge of accommodations. The first time I was assigned the basement, I was 12. "Jessica, sweetie," my mother said, carrying my bedding downstairs. "Aunt Patricia and Uncle Jim need the guest room, and your cousins will be in the attic. Mark obviously needs his space for training, and Danielle gets migraines if she doesn't. Have her blackout curtains?" "But what about my room?" I asked. "Well, Grandma needs to be close to the bathroom, so she'll take your room." My mother fluffed a pillow on the pull-out sofa that had seen better days. "It's just for a week. You're always so good about these things." I tried to be good about it. I didn't complain when the water heater's constant hum kept me awake, or when the single bulb overhead burned out mid-week, leaving me to navigate by flashlight. I didn't mention the silverfish in the shower or how the dampness made my asthma worse. The next year, I assumed things would be different. They weren't. Once again, I was delegated to the basement while everyone else enjoyed proper bedrooms. The explanation changed. This time it was because my room had the best morning light for my aunt's painting hobby. But the result was the same. By the 3rd year, no explanation was offered at all. It was simply expected that Jessica would take the basement. It became a joke within the family. "Jess in her basement apartment," they'd laugh. She's the only one who doesn't mind. But I did mind. I minded terribly. I remember one particular night when a summer storm knocked out the power. The basement, with no windows to let in moonlight, went pitch black. The backup generator kicked in for the main house, but no one thought to run an extension cord downstairs for me. I spent the night huddled under blankets, listening to the thunder shake the foundation, while upstairs my family played board games by lamplight. The next morning, when I emerged pale and exhausted, my father looked surprised. "Oh, were you scared down there? You should have come upstairs." As if I hadn't knocked on the door for 20 minutes, my calls drowned out by their laughter and music. These patterns repeated year after year. My accomplishments minimized, my comfort sacrificed, my presence an afterthought. But children adapt to survive, and I adapted by making myself useful. If I couldn't be the favorite, I would be the dependable one. If I couldn't shine, I would support those who did. I became the family organizer, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who helped with homework and science projects, who drove siblings to practices and auditions once I had my license. I was the unofficial photographer who documented everyone else's special moments, the mediator during arguments, the shoulder to cry on after breakups. In return, I received distracted thank yous and the occasional, "What would we do without you, Jess?" It wasn't love, not really. It was appreciation for services rendered, the kind you might feel for a reliable appliance. By the time I graduated high school, second in my class, though no one attended the ceremony because it conflicted with Danielle's dance competition, I had perfected the art of expecting nothing, while giving everything. I had become exactly what they needed me to be, invisible until useful. Getting into Cornell on a full academic scholarship was my ticket out. For the first time, I would be judged on my own merits, not measured against my siblings' blazing stars. I would have a room of my own that no one could relegate me from. I would build a life where I mattered. Those 4 years were transformative. I discovered economics and fell in love with the elegant logic of financial systems. I found friends who actually listened when I spoke. I joined the investment club and discovered I had a knack for spotting undervalued assets, perhaps because I'd been undervalued my entire life. My professors noticed my abilities. "You have remarkable analytical skills, Jessica," my advisor told me during my junior year. "You see patterns others miss." This validation was intoxicating. Here, in this new world, my quiet thoughtfulness wasn't a liability. It was my greatest strength. I graduated summa cum laude and received offers from several prestigious financial firms. I chose Barrett Financial in New York, partly for their excellent training program and partly because it put 70 miles between me and Lakeside. Not far enough to raise eyebrows, but far enough that surprise visits would be inconvenient. I threw myself into my career with the same intensity I'd once devoted to trying to win my family's approval. I worked 14-hour days, took on the clients no one else wanted, and volunteered for projects that required holiday work. My colleagues assumed I was gunning for early promotion. The truth was simpler. I had nothing else in my life that mattered as much. My first apartment was tiny but mine, a studio in Brooklyn with a fire escape where I could sit with a glass of wine and watch the city lights. No one could relegate me to a basement here. No one could claim my space for a more deserving occupant. For the first time, I wasn't the afterthought in my own home. Still, every summer, duty called me back to Lakeside for the family reunion. And every summer, without discussion, my suitcase was carried to the basement upon arrival. "Jessica, you know the drill?" my mother would say with a laugh that suggested this was a cherished tradition rather than a persistent slight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everyone's counting on you to be the basement queen. I smiled and nodded, playing my assigned role. But each year, as I lay on that sagging pull-out couch listening to the floorboards creak with the weight of family members who had proper beds, the resentment grew. Not a hot, explosive anger, but something cooler and more calculated. I was advancing quickly at Barrett Financial. By my 5th year, I was handling accounts for high-net-worth individuals, helping them grow their wealth through strategic investments. My clients trusted me because I was thorough, perceptive, and unfailingly honest. My bonus that year was more than my father had made in his best year as a high school history teacher. Not that my family knew this. When they asked about my job, I kept it vague. Still at the same company, I'd say. It's going well. They rarely pressed for details, content with the narrative they'd created. Jessica has a nice, stable job. Nothing flashy, nothing exceptional. Exactly what we'd expect. Meanwhile, Mark had followed the expected path to medical glory, becoming a surgeon at a prestigious Boston hospital. Danielle had leveraged her beauty and social media savvy into a career as a lifestyle influencer, partnering with brands and traveling the world for content. Their achievements were cataloged, celebrated, displayed. At family gatherings, the conversation revolved around Mark's difficult surgeries and Danielle's growing follower count. My work in finance was reduced to, Jessica does something with money, usually followed by a joke about having me do their taxes. I stopped correcting them. There was a certain power in being underestimated, I discovered. While they saw me as the same predictable Jessica, I was quietly building something they couldn't imagine. The catalyst, the moment everything shifted, happened 3 summers ago. I was 28 and had just been promoted to senior manager, overseeing a team and a portfolio that included several millionaire clients. I had taken 2 precious weeks of vacation to attend the family reunion, hoping that perhaps this time, with my new title and responsibilities, things might be different. They weren't. Jessica, we put your things in the basement, my mother said the moment I arrived, not even bothering to phrase it as a request or apology. Your cousin Amy is bringing her new boyfriend, and we thought they'd be more comfortable in your old room. I stood there, designer suitcase in hand, a gift from a grateful client, as Amy, a cousin I barely knew, walked past me with a guy she'd been dating for 3 months, headed for my childhood bedroom. The pullout has been acting up, my father added, not looking up from his newspaper. You might need to sleep on the air mattress instead. There's one in the storage closet. That evening, during the welcome dinner, I watched as my family fawned over Mark's new girlfriend, a pediatric surgeon, of course, and gasped appropriately as Danielle showed off the free products she'd received from her latest brand partnership. My father stood to make his traditional family toast. I'm so blessed to have this family, he said, raising his glass. Mark saving lives in Boston, Danielle bringing beauty to the world from Los Angeles, and all you wonderful relatives who make the Walsh name something to be proud of. I waited for my mention. It never came. After dinner, as I was clearing plates, another task that somehow always fell to me, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Did you see Mark's new car? My mother whispered excitedly. A Tesla. He said the hospital gives them special financing. And Danielle's going to be the face of that new skincare line, my father added proudly. Our kids are really making names for themselves. Our kids. As if I wasn't their child at all. I stood frozen in the dining room, stack of dirty plates in hand, as a cold clarity washed over me. This wasn't going to change. I could become the CEO of my firm, and they would still put me in the basement. I could cure cancer, and they would still forget to mention me in the family toast. I had been trying to earn a place at a table where there was never going to be a seat for me. That night, on the air mattress that slowly deflated throughout the night, the pullout was indeed broken, its metal frame bent beyond repair. I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I was done trying to fit into the narrow space my family had assigned me. Instead, I would build something so expansive that their limited vision would no longer be able to contain me. The next morning, I told my parents I had an emergency at work and needed to leave. They barely looked up from their coffee, just nodded and said, "That's too bad. Will you be back for the clam bake on Friday?" "No," I said quietly. "I don't think so." They didn't ask why. They didn't try to convince me to stay. They just accepted my absence as easily as they had always accepted my presence, without much thought at all. I drove away from Lakeside with a strange lightness in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't leaving with the weight of disappointment. I was leaving with purpose. I didn't go back to my apartment in New York. Instead, I drove straight to the office, walked into my boss's office, and requested a transfer to our London branch. He was surprised. I had never shown interest in international positions before, but my performance record spoke for itself. 3 weeks later, I was settling into a small flat in Notting Hill, an ocean away from the family that had never truly seen me. In London, I reinvented myself. Not in a superficial way. I didn't change my appearance or adopt an accent, but in a fundamental shift of how I moved through the world. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped downplaying my accomplishments. I stopped accepting less than I deserved. My British colleagues didn't know the basement-dwelling Jessica. They knew the sharp, insightful manager who could spot market trends before anyone else. I no longer felt the need to shrink myself to avoid outshining anyone. The result was immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months, I had brought in 3 major clients. Within a year, I had established myself as an expert in property investments and wealth management for high-net-worth individuals. I worked with tech entrepreneurs expanding into European markets, old money families looking to diversify their holdings, and forward-thinking investors seeking the next emerging opportunity. My bosses noticed. "Jessica, you've brought in more new business this quarter than anyone in the division's history," my director told me during my review. "We're putting you on the fast track for partner." Meanwhile, back home, nothing changed. My parents called occasionally, brief conversations that focused on family news, Mark's latest achievement, Danielle's newest collaboration, my cousin's wedding that I had missed. They never asked detailed questions about my work or my life in London. When I mentioned my promotion, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately pivoting to Mark's new house in Beacon Hill. I stopped volunteering information. On holiday video calls, I would sit in my flat with a nondescript wall behind me, letting them assume I was living the same modest life I had in New York. I sent birthday cards and appropriate gifts. I made the expected noises about missing them. But internally, I was severing the emotional ties that had kept me tethered to their expectations. 2 years after moving to London, I became the youngest partner in the firm's history. My client roster now included billionaires and royal family, members from smaller European countries. I had a team of analysts reporting to me and a compensation package that would have made even Mark's surgeon friends envious. During this time, I had begun investing in properties, first in London, then across Europe, and finally back in the United States. I had a talent for identifying undervalued assets in desirable locations, purchasing them before the broader market recognized their potential, and either developing them myself or flipping them to select clients for substantial profits. 1 day, scrolling through property listings in the Northeast, a particular estate caught my eye. A historic mansion on Lake Warramog in Washington, Connecticut, just 30 minutes from my parents' home in Lakeside. The majestic stone residence with its private dock, guest house, and 10 acres of woodland had been the crown jewel of the area for generations. I remembered how my family would drive past that lake during summer outings. My father would slow the car as we passed the grand estates along the shore, pointing out the boathouses and private docks. "That's what real success looks like," he would say. "Old money, real class, not something you see every day in our circles." The Whitcomb estate, as it was known, had belonged to the same family for over a century. The current owners, an elderly couple with no heirs, were looking to downsize to a property in Florida. The asking price was $8.7 million, a substantial sum, but well within my means given my partnership stake and investment returns. I made an offer the same day. All cash, no contingencies, with a request for discretion regarding the buyer's identity. The Whitcombs accepted, pleased to avoid the typical parade of prospective buyers through their family home. Over the next 6 months, I worked with architects and designers to restore and update the property while preserving its historic character. I added modern amenities, a home theater, a state-of-the-art kitchen, a climate-controlled wine cellar, while maintaining the mansion's Gilded Age grandeur. The renovations cost nearly as much as the purchase price, but the result was extraordinary, a showplace that honored its past while embracing the future. All this time, I maintained my distance from my family. I sent the obligatory holiday cards, made brief appearances on video calls, responded to occasional emails with pleasant but uninformative updates. As far as they knew, I was still the same Jessica. Reliable, unremarkable, easy to forget. I never mentioned London, my promotion to partner, or certainly not the lake house. For the first time in my life, I understood the power of being underestimated. While they weren't looking, I had built an empire. This summer marked my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, coinciding with the annual family reunion. My mother called to invite me, her voice carrying the usual assumption that I would come and take my place in the basement. "We're making it extra special this year," she said. "Mark is flying in his new girlfriend. She's a pediatric surgeon. And Danielle's bringing her photographer to document everything for her lifestyle blog." "Sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll be there." Then I added, "Actually, I have an idea. Why don't we hold the reunion at Lake Warramog this year? I know a place." "Lake Warramog?" My mother laughed as if I'd suggested hosting it on the moon. "Jessica, those homes are worth millions. We can't afford that." "Don't worry about it," I said. "Consider it arranged." "Honey, I don't think you understand what those rentals cost for a week, even if we all chipped in." "Mom," I interrupted gently. "I said I'll handle it. Just tell everyone to meet at the Lakeside coffee shop at noon on Saturday. A shuttle will pick everyone up." There was a long pause. "Well, if you're sure. But don't get yourself into financial trouble over this. We're perfectly happy having it at the house like always." "I'm sure," I said. "And Mom, tell everyone to pack for a full week. There's plenty of room." The day of the reunion arrived warm and sunny, a perfect Connecticut summer day. I had been at the lake house for a week already, overseeing final preparations. Every detail had been attended to, rooms assigned and prepared according to each guest's preferences, information gleaned from casual conversations with my mother, activities planned, menus designed with everyone's favorite foods. From my bedroom window, I watched as the luxury shuttle I'd arranged pulled into the coffee shop parking lot. One by one, my family members boarded: my parents, Mark and his surgeon girlfriend, Danielle and her photographer boyfriend, aunts, uncles, cousins, their faces showing confusion as they settled into the plush leather seats. 20 minutes later, the shuttle turned off the main road onto a tree-lined private drive. As it wound through manicured grounds toward the stone mansion, I moved from my window to the front entrance, positioning myself at the top of the grand staircase that led from the circular driveway to the massive oak doors. The shuttle stopped. The driver opened the door, and my family emerged, their expressions a mixture of awe and bewilderment as they took in the sweeping lake views, the immaculate gardens, and the imposing house. "There must be some mistake," my mother said, her voice carrying across the lawn. "This is the Whitcomb estate." "Not anymore," I called down to them, drawing all eyes upward. I stood in a simple but elegant white dress, a contrast to the jeans and casual tops they were accustomed to seeing. "Mian, welcome to my home." The silence was absolute. My father's mouth literally hung open. Mark dropped his designer luggage onto the gravel. Danielle's photographer instinctively started snapping pictures before she slapped his camera down. "That's not possible," my father finally managed, shaking his head. "You can't afford this." I descended the stairs slowly, savoring each step. "I've been a partner at Barrett Financial for over a year now," I said when I reached them. "Our London office. I specialize in high-value property investments and wealth management. This estate is just one of my investments." My mother's hand fluttered to her throat. "London? Partner? But why didn't you tell us?" "Would you have listened if I had?" I asked quietly. No one had an answer for that. The staff began unloading the luggage from the shuttle. "I've prepared rooms for everyone," I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Mark, you and Sarah will be in the East Wing guest suite. It has a lovely view of the sunrise. Danielle, I thought you'd appreciate the room with the best natural light for your social media content. Mom and Dad, you're in the garden suite on the main floor." I turned to my extended family. "Everyone else, the guest house has been prepared, with comfortable accommodations. There's a map in each room showing the grounds and amenities." "And where will you be staying, Jessica?" my father asked, his expression still dazed. I gestured to the main house with its grand entrance and panoramic lake view. "I'll be in the master suite," I said simply. "Where I belong." As they filed past me into the house, their faces registered emotions ranging from shock to embarrassment to calculation. No one quite knew how to react to this new reality, least of all my parents, who kept looking around as if expecting to wake from a dream. That evening, I hosted a welcome dinner on the terrace overlooking the lake. The table was set with fine china and crystal, softly lit by candles as the sun set over the water. A private chef served course after course of exquisite food, while attentive staff kept wine glasses filled. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone careful around me in a way they had never been before. But as the wine flowed and the beauty of the setting worked its magic, the atmosphere gradually relaxed. Stories were told, jokes shared, memories revisited. My father, seated at the opposite end of the table from me, a deliberate choice on my part, finally raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "To Jessica, for this incredible hospitality." It wasn't much, but it was the first time he had ever publicly acknowledged something I had done. The bar was low, but it was a start. After dinner, as everyone dispersed to explore the grounds or retire to their rooms, my parents approached me as I stood by the stone balustrade, watching the moonlight play on the lake's surface. "Jessica," my mother began hesitantly, "this place it's beyond words. We had no idea you were so successful," I offered. "Capable? Worth noticing?" My father winced. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked. "For 15 years, I was the one in the basement, the afterthought, the practical one who wouldn't mind, who wouldn't complain, who would understand." "We never meant to make you feel less than," my mother insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "But you did," I said, not unkindly. Every reunion, every conversation, every family dinner where my achievements were footnotes while Mark and Danielle were the headlines. My father looked out at the lake, unable to meet my eyes. "So this is what? Revenge? Showing us up?" I shook my head. "No. This is me finally understanding that I don't need your validation to know my worth. I don't need to squeeze into the spaces you leave for me. I can create my own space." I gestured to the grand estate around us. "I didn't buy this house to prove something to you. I bought it to prove something to myself. That I could build a life so abundant that no one, not even the people who raised me, could make me feel small within it." I turned to face them fully. "This reunion isn't about making you feel bad. It's about me finally taking my place in this family as an equal. Not the forgotten daughter you relegate to the basement, but someone worthy of respect. My mother wiped away a tear. We respect you, Jessica, we always have. No, I said gently. You've taken me for granted. There's a difference. My father cleared his throat. Can you forgive us? I considered this for a moment. I'm not interested in forgiveness right now, I told him honestly. I'm interested in change, real change in how this family operates. And that starts with never again assuming that anyone's comfort, dignity, or accomplishments matter less than anyone else's. I left them there on the terrace, giving them space to absorb what I had said. As I walked through my beautiful home, past relatives who now looked at me with new eyes, I felt neither triumph nor vindication. Instead, I felt something simpler and more profound. Peace. The girl from the basement hadn't disappeared. She had grown into a woman who built herself a castle. Not out of spite, but out of the quiet certainty that she deserved the space to become exactly who she was meant to be. The morning after the welcome dinner, I woke before sunrise. This had become my habit in London. Early mornings spent reviewing market reports while the city was still quiet. Now, I slipped on a silk robe and made my way to the kitchen, expecting to have the house to myself for at least another hour. To my surprise, my father was already there, sitting at the marble island with a cup of coffee, staring out at the lake where mist still hovered over the water. You're up early, I said, moving to the espresso machine. He startled slightly, then nodded. Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts. The silence between us felt heavy as I prepared my coffee. I had expected satisfaction in witnessing my family's shock, perhaps even a certain vindictive pleasure. Instead, I felt strangely hollow. The validation I had imagined for so long was finally here, yet it brought none of the comfort I had anticipated. I kept thinking about what you said last night, my father finally offered. His voice sounded older than I remembered, more fragile. About us making you feel less than. I didn't respond immediately, focusing on the precise motions of making my espresso. Only when the rich aroma filled the air did I turn to face him. It wasn't just a feeling, Dad. It was reality. Every summer, like clockwork, the basement became Jessica's spot. Not because it made sense, but because everyone else's comfort was prioritized over mine. He winced. It wasn't intentional. That almost makes it worse, I said, taking a seat across from him. You didn't even have to think about it. Relegating me to the worst sleeping arrangements was so automatic, so natural, that you didn't even question it. My father stared into his coffee cup. Your mother and I, we always thought you were the strong one, the one who didn't need us. Hovering. Mark was always so insecure under all that bravado, and Danielle... He shook his head. Well, you know how fragile her self-esteem can be despite the social media persona. So I was punished for being resilient. Not punished, he insisted. We just took for granted that you'd be okay. I sipped my espresso, letting the bitter warmth spread through me. There's a difference between being strong and being treated as if your comfort doesn't matter. My father nodded slowly. I see that now. Too late, I suppose. We sat in silence, for a while, watching as the sun began to break through the mist over the lake, casting long golden rays across the water. A pair of loons called to each other, their haunting cries echoing across the still morning. This view, my father said eventually. It reminds me of that summer we rented the cabin on Candlewood Lake. You were about 8. Remember how you used to get up early to watch the sunrise? I did remember. It had been one of the few family vacations where I hadn't felt peripheral. A small cabin where we all shared space equally, no hierarchy of rooms. You would sit on the dock with your sketch pad, he continued, drawing the birds, so patient, so focused, even then. I still have those sketches, I admitted. In a portfolio in my London flat. His eyebrows rose in surprise. You kept them all these years? They were important to me. I didn't add that they represented one of the few times I felt he had actually seen me, really seen me, as I was, not as an afterthought to my siblings. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps announced the arrival of others. Mark appeared in the doorway, dressed in designer athleisure wear, clearly prepared for a morning run. Whoa, kitchen bigger than my entire Boston apartment, hi, observed with a low whistle. Coffee smells amazing. And just like that, the moment of potential connection with my father evaporated. Mark moved into the kitchen with his usual confidence, immediately commanding the space in a way I never could. My father's attention shifted to him automatically, asking about his running route, suggesting trails around the property. I finished, my espresso in silence, observing this familiar dynamic from a new perspective. In the past, I would have shrunk away, accepting my return to invisibility. Today, I remained exactly where I was, neither competing for attention nor relinquishing. My place. The rest of the morning unfolded as I had planned. Staff served a lavish breakfast buffet on the terrace. I had arranged activities to suit various interests: tennis on the private court, swimming in the lake or the infinity pool, massages in the spa room, a guided tour of the wine cellar. Watching my family navigate this luxury, awkward at first, then, with growing enthusiasm, was fascinating. Danielle, predictably, was in her element. By mid-morning, she had already filmed 3 separate content pieces, showing off different areas of the estate, careful to frame me out of every shot. I caught her instructing her photographer boyfriend to get footage of her casually reading by the pool, as if she were the lady of the house rather than a guest. The lighting is perfect here, she gushed when she noticed me watching. Your place is totally Insta-worthy, Jess. You should let me tag you in my posts. My followers would go crazy for this aesthetics. I prefer my privacy, I said mildly. But you're welcome to photograph the house, just not me. She frowned slightly. But it would really help your image. I could introduce you as my successful finance sis. We could do a whole series on women in male-dominated fields. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of barely acknowledging my career, now she wanted to capitalize on it for content. I don't need help with my image, I told her. My reputation in my field is well established. But no one knows about it, she persisted. You've been like hiding your success. I studied my younger sister, trying to see past the polished exterior to the person underneath. Had she really not considered why I might have kept my achievements private? Did she truly not understand how it felt to have your accomplishments consistently overshadowed? I wasn't hiding, I said carefully. I was simply waiting for the right moment to share. And for people who would actually appreciate it for what it is, not for how they could benefit from it. The subtle barb landed. Danielle's perfect features rearranged themselves into a wounded expression. That's not fair. I'm just trying to help you get recognition. I don't need recognition from your Instagram followers, I said. I've built my success without an audience, and I'm comfortable with that. She huffed slightly. Well, excuse me for trying to be supportive. Some people would kill for this kind of exposure. I'm not some people, I reminded her. I'm your sister. The same sister who used to help you with your homework and drove you to dance competitions when Mom and Dad were busy with Mark's games. The sister who was always there but somehow never worth mentioning in your blessed family posts. Danielle had the grace to look embarrassed. I didn't realize you even noticed that stuff. Of course I noticed, I said. Just because I didn't demand attention doesn't mean I didn't want to be included. My sister fidgeted with her phone, clearly uncomfortable with this direct confrontation. In our family, unpleasant truths were typically brushed aside. Grievances, left to fester beneath the surface of polite interaction. I'm sorry, she finally offered. I guess I got caught up in building my brand. It's competitive out there, you know? always having to be perfect, always having to show the best version of everything. For the first time, I glimpsed something genuine beneath her carefully curated persona, a flash of the insecurity my father had alluded to earlier. "You don't have to be perfect here," I told her. "This isn't content. This is family." She nodded slowly, seeming to consider this. "So, are we okay?" "We're getting there," I said honestly. "But rebuilding relationships takes more than one conversation." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activity. I moved between groups of relatives, playing the gracious hostess while observing the shifting dynamics. My parents seemed unusually subdued, watching me with a mixture of pride and uncertainty, as if seeing a stranger wearing their daughter's face. My uncles, who had previously treated me with benign disinterest, now sought me out for financial advice. Cousins who had barely spoken to me at past reunions suddenly found me fascinating. It was both gratifying and slightly depressing to witness how dramatically wealth altered their perception. That evening, I had arranged for a sunset cruise on a vintage wooden yacht I kept docked at the boathouse. As we glided across the lake, champagne flowing freely and a small jazz ensemble playing on the deck, I found myself standing alone at the railing, watching the magnificent estate grow smaller in the distance. Quite the statement piece. Came Mark's voice as he joined me. The house, the boat, all of it. I glanced at my brother, noting the tension around his eyes despite his casual tone. Mark had always been the star of the family, his path to glory predetermined and celebrated at every turn. Now, for the first time, he was confronting the reality that his unremarkable sister had achieved something beyond his reach. "It's not a statement," I replied. "It's my home." "Come on, Jess," he gave a short laugh. "You have to admit there's a certain dramatic reveal happening here. You could have told us you were doing well ages ago." "Would you have cared?" I asked bluntly. "Would it have changed anything about how you saw me?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he sighed. "Probably not," he admitted. "I've been self-absorbed. It's an occupational hazard when everyone's been telling you how special you are since Little League." The honesty was unexpected. Mark and I had never been close, not enemies, but operating in entirely different spheres. He had always been the golden boy, destined for glory, while I was the dependable middle child, expected to orbit his greatness along with everyone else. "It's weird," he continued, "seeing you like this, confident, in charge. The Jessica I remember was always so quiet." "I was quiet because no one was listening," I said. "Not because I had nothing to say." He winced slightly at that. "Fair point." We stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose. The shore was dotted with other grand estates, but none quite matched the classic elegance of mine. I had chosen it not only for its beauty but for its history, a house that had weathered a century of change while maintaining its dignity. "How did you do it?" Mark finally asked. "The money, I mean. Did you marry some rich British guy or something?" I nearly laughed at the transparent hope in his voice, the desire for a simple explanation that would preserve his worldview. How much easier it would be to attribute my success to a man rather than acknowledge that I had built it myself. "No, Mark. I did it through work, hard work, smart investments, and a talent for finance that no one in this family ever bothered to notice." He had the decency to look ashamed. "I guess we all had you pegged wrong." "You never tried to know me," I said simply. "None of you did." Mark nodded slowly. "I'm starting to see that." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm impressed. Surgeon money is good, but not private yacht on a private lake good." It was the closest thing to genuine admiration I had ever received from my brother. Coming from Mark, who measured his worth in achievements and accolades, this acknowledgement of being outpaced was significant. Thank you, I said. That actually means something. We fell into a more comfortable silence then, side by side at the railing as the boat began its return journey. The lake house was now visible again, windows glowing amber against the deepening twilight, a beacon calling us home. So what now? Mark asked eventually. Now that we all know you're basically the most successful Walsh in history? I considered this question carefully. What did I want from this revelation? Not groveling apologies or performative praise, not revenge, despite what my father had suggested. Something more fundamental, more lasting. Now we start over, I said. As equals. Not as the star siblings and the basement dweller. Just 3 adults who happen to be related, learning to see each other clearly for perhaps the first time. Mark nodded thoughtfully. I can work with that. Then, with a glimpse of his old competitive spirit, he added, but fair warning, now that I know what you're capable of, I might need to step up my game. I smiled despite myself. Some things would never change completely, but the baseline had shifted, and that was enough for now. As the boat docked at my private pier, I watched my family disembark. My parents with their careful politeness, Danielle already planning her next photo opportunity, aunts and uncles and cousins still adjusting to this new reality. They were the same people they had always been, but the dynamic had fundamentally altered. I had expected to feel triumphant in this moment, vindicated after years of dismissal. Instead, I felt something more complex, a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, pride and lingering hurt. The wounds of neglect don't heal overnight, even when wrapped in the finest bandages money can buy. That night, I sat alone in my study long after everyone else had retired to their rooms. The space was lined with bookshelves housing rare first editions, the desk a magnificent antique I had purchased at auction in London. Through the windows, the moonlight cast a silver path across the dark lake, a mirror to the stars above. I poured myself a small glass of aged whiskey, a habit acquired from a Scottish client who had taught me to appreciate the subtle complexity of a good single malt. As I sipped, I reflected on the day's conversations and the subtle shifts they represented. Not the wholesale transformation I might have imagined in my revenge fantasies, but small fissures in the foundations of old patterns. It was a beginning. The soft knock at the door surprised me. When I called "Come in," my mother appeared, wrapped, in a silk robe I had laid out for her. One of many thoughtful touches I had arranged to demonstrate the consideration they had never shown me. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said hesitantly. I saw the light under the door. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing to the chair opposite mine. "Would you like a drink?" She shook her head, but took the seat, her eyes traveling over the elegant room with its evidence of wealth and taste. "This house," she said softly, "it's like something from a movie." "It's real," I assured her. "All of it." My mother nodded, her fingers worrying at the sash of her robe. "Your father and I have been talking about what you said, about how we treated you." I waited, neither helping her through this difficult conversation nor shutting it down. This was her moment to find the words, not mine to provide them. "We failed you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We took you for granted. We assumed your strength meant you didn't need our support or recognition." "And that justified putting me in the basement year after year?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral rather than accusatory. She winced. "There's no justification. It was thoughtless and cruel, even if we didn't intend it that way." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I could say we were busy with Mark's problems or Danielle's insecurities, but the truth is simpler and worse. We just didn't think about how it affected you. The admission hung in the air between us, stark in its honesty. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked after a moment. It wasn't just the basement. It was how no one ever asked if I minded. How it became a family joke. Jessica and her basement apartment. As if my discomfort was somehow amusing. My mother's eyes filled with tears. I never thought of it that way. I just assumed. I don't even know what I assumed. That you were fine with it, I suppose. I wasn't fine with it, I said quietly. I just learned early that expressing my needs didn't change anything, so I stopped trying. She reached across the space between us, hesitantly placing her hand on mine. I'm so sorry, Jessica. Not just for the basement, but for all the ways we overlooked you, for taking your help for granted, for not celebrating your accomplishments the way we did your siblings. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt insufficient, against the weight of years of neglect. One conversation couldn't erase decades of patterns. I appreciate that, I said carefully, but understanding how deeply I was hurt is just the beginning. Real change will take time and consistent effort. My mother nodded, wiping away a tear. I know, and I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope we can start rebuilding something better. Something where you're not an afterthought. I'd like that, I admitted, but it has to be different this time. I won't go back to being invisible. You could never be invisible again, she said with a small, sad smile. Not the woman you've become. We talked for another hour, covering ground we had never explored before. She shared worries about Mark's perfectionism, Danielle's fragile sense of self beneath the confident exterior. I spoke about my early years in finance, the challenges of building a reputation in a male-dominated industry, the satisfaction of seeing my investments flourish. For the first time in memory, my mother actually listened when I spoke about my work, asking thoughtful questions rather than nodding politely before changing the subject. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the most authentic conversation we had ever had. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. This house, she said, it suits you. Not because of the grandeur, but because of the strength it represents. The quiet dignity. That's always been you, Jessica. I just didn't see it clearly until now. After she left, I remained in the study, nursing the last of my whiskey as I considered her words. The house did suit me, not because of its impressive facade, but because of its substance. The solid stone construction that had weathered a century of storms. The careful craftsmanship visible in every detail. The quiet elegance that didn't need to announce itself to be appreciated. The following days developed a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast on the terrace, followed by various activities I had arranged, sailing on the lake, hiking the woodland trails, wine tastings in the cellar. Afternoons often found family members scattered throughout the property, some napping in hammocks strung between ancient oak trees, others reading in the library or playing board games in the sunroom. I maintained my role as gracious hostess while also creating space for private moments. Early morning swims before anyone else was awake, solitary walks along the shoreline at dusk. These quiet intervals allowed me to process the shifting family dynamics and maintain my equilibrium amid the emotional currents. My relationship with each family member evolved in its own way. My father, initially defensive, gradually became more reflective, sharing stories from my childhood that revealed a more attentive perspective than I had remembered. Danielle oscillated between competitive comparisons and genuine attempts at connection. Mark, surprisingly, proved the most adaptable, his natural competitiveness giving way to a pragmatic acceptance of our new equal footing. Extended family members followed their lead, recalibrating their interactions with me based on my parents' example. Cousins who had previously overlooked me now sought me out for conversation. Aunts who had always directed their questions to my siblings now engaged with me directly, showing interest in my life and work. The transformation wasn't universal or unblemished. There were still moments of old patterns reasserting themselves. My Mother automatically asking Danielle to help plan the menu for a special dinner while assigning me to practical logistics, my father falling into familiar rhythms of celebrating Mark's accomplishments while merely acknowledging mine. The difference was that now, when these patterns emerged, I no longer accepted them silently. I would point them out calmly but firmly, refusing to slip back into the role of the overlooked middle child. Sometimes this created tension, uncomfortable silences that reflected the difficulty of changing long-established dynamics. But increasingly, my observations were met with recognition and adjustment, small course corrections that indicated genuine effort. Midway through the week, I arranged a formal anniversary dinner for my parents. The dining room was transformed with flowers, candles, and finest china. A private chef prepared a menu that incorporated favorites from throughout their 40 years, together. I gave a toast that acknowledged the complexity of family bonds while expressing hope for growth and deeper understanding in the years ahead. My father responded with uncharacteristic emotional openness, his voice breaking as he thanked me not only for the evening but for showing us parts of yourself we should have seen long ago. Later that night, as the celebration wound down, I found myself on the terrace with my cousin Amy, the same cousin whose boyfriend had been given my childhood bedroom during the reunion that had precipitated my transformation. "This week has been eye-opening," she said, gesturing with her champagne glass toward the moonlit lake. "Not just the house and everything, but seeing how everyone is with you now. Different." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Amy considered. "This. More careful, more attentive. Like they're finally seeing you clearly." She paused, then added with surprising insight. "It makes me wonder how many times I did the same thing. Just looked past you because that's what everyone else was doing." Her honesty was refreshing. "Probably more than you realize," I said, "but fewer times than some others." "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for being part of that pattern." I nodded, accepting the apology for what it was, a small acknowledgement of a larger truth. "The interesting thing about patterns," I observed, "is that once you see them clearly, you can't unsee them. They become obvious in a way they never were before." Amy glanced back toward the house, where my parents were saying goodnight to departing guests. "They're really trying, you know. Your parents. I overheard your mom telling my mom how proud she is of you, how she wishes she had paid more attention all along." "Wishes are easy," I said. "Change is harder." "But possible," Amy suggested. "Don't you think?" I considered this as I watched my family moving through spaces I had created, navigating relationships that were being reinvented with each interaction. The past couldn't be undone, the years of feeling peripheral couldn't be erased. But perhaps new patterns could be established, new foundations laid. "Yes," I said finally, "change is possible. Not perfect, not complete, but possible." And in that moment, standing in the home I had built for myself, surrounded by family members who were seeing me clearly perhaps for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or vindication, but a quiet hope. Not for a storybook reconciliation where all hurts were magically healed, but for something more authentic, a family learning, however imperfectly, to rewrite its story. The basement girl hadn't disappeared. She had simply found her place in the light. As the reunion week progressed, I found myself observing my family through the lens of my professional expertise. In finance, we're taught to look for patterns, to identify assets that are undervalued by the market, to recognize the difference between perceived worth and intrinsic value. My family had consistently undervalued me, had failed to recognize my potential, had assigned me a place in their hierarchy that reflected their perception rather than my reality. The fourth day of the reunion began with a gentle rain tapping against the windows, transforming the lake into a canvas of ripples and turning the surrounding forest a deeper shade of green. I had arranged for a skilled massage therapist to set up in the conservatory, offering treatments to anyone interested. The rainy day provided a perfect excuse for indoor relaxation and quiet reflection. Over breakfast, as my relatives discussed their plans for the day, most opting for the massage, others eyeing the extensive library or home theater, I noticed my brother Mark watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the competitive assessment I was accustomed to, nor the dismissive glance of someone looking past me to more interesting prospects. There was something almost like admiration in his gaze, mingled with curiosity. When the others dispersed, he lingered, refilling his coffee cup and taking the seat across from me at the kitchen island. "Last night got me thinking," he said without preamble, "about that summer when I was 16 and you were 14. Remember when Dad promised to take us fishing at Candlewood Lake?" The memory surfaced immediately. My father had talked for weeks about a father-son fishing trip, only to decide at the last minute that I should come along too, since my mother and Danielle were visiting my aunt. "I remember," I said cautiously, unsure where he was going with this. Mark studied his coffee. "I was such a jerk about it. Complained the whole drive there about how you would ruin it, how you wouldn't know what to do, how it was supposed to be Guys' time." I remembered that too. The sting of his words, the way my father had said nothing to defend my inclusion. "But then," Mark continued, "you caught that monster bass, the one Dad and I had been trying for all morning." He shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. "I was so angry. Not just that you caught it, but that you did it so methodically. Reading that fishing guide the night before, observing where we cast and failed, then just succeeding where we'd struggled." "I didn't know you were angry," I said. "I thought you were impressed." He laughed softly. "That's the thing about you, Jess. You've always been better at reading markets than people. I was furious and jealous. Dad couldn't stop talking about it on the drive home. His little girl with the natural fishing talent." The memory shifted slightly with this new information. I had treasured that day as one of the rare occasions when my father had seemed genuinely proud of me. I hadn't registered Mark's resentment beneath his grudging congratulations. "The thing is," he continued, "that's been the pattern, hasn't it? You succeeding quietly while I made all the noise, me getting the attention while you got the results." He gestured around the magnificent kitchen. "And here we are, the perfect proof." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a rueful acknowledgement of a truth long unspoken. "I never wanted to compete with you, Mark," I said honestly. "I just wanted my own achievements to be recognized on their own merits." He nodded slowly. "I know that now. But back then, maybe even until this week, I think I needed the spotlight so badly that I was happy to see it directed away from you." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I'm sorry for that." The apology was unexpected and oddly affecting. Mark and I had never had the kind of relationship where we discussed feelings or acknowledged hurts. We had operated in separate spheres, intersecting mainly at family gatherings where his stellar trajectory was celebrated, while my steady progress was noted in passing, if at all. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "It means something coming. From you." "Not before time," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "It only took a multi-million-dollar estate to make me see what was right in front of me all along." We shared a genuine laugh then, the kind of moment that had been rare between us. As adults, we had developed a polite but distant relationship. Holiday phone calls and birthday texts maintaining the minimum connection expected of siblings. This conversation felt like the beginning of something more authentic. Not necessarily closer, but more honest. As the day progressed, I moved through the house, checking on guests, ensuring everything ran smoothly. The massage therapist was booked solid, with my mother emerging from her session declaring it the best massage of my life. My Uncle Robert dozed in the library, a first edition Hemingway open on his chest. Cousins gathered in the game room, the the competitive shouts from a pool tournament occasionally echoing through the hallways. In the late afternoon, as the rain cleared and weak sunshine broke through the clouds, I found myself drawn to the boathouse. It was one of my favorite spots on the property, a beautifully restored structure with its original beams exposed, housing not only my vintage Riva but also a small sitting area where I often came to read or simply watch the play of light on water. I was surprised to find Danielle already there, sitting in one of the Adirondack chairs facing the lake, her ever-present phone nowhere in sight. She looked up as I entered, her expression unguarded in a way I rarely saw. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's your house," she replied with a small smile. "Pretty sure you can go wherever you want." I took the chair next to hers, and for a few minutes we sat in companionable silence, watching a heron stalk through the shallows at the lake's edge, its movements deliberate and precise. "I've been thinking about what you said," Danielle finally offered, "about me never featuring you in my social posts about family." I waited, letting her find her way through the conversation. At first I got defensive, Told myself it was because you're private, or because you were never around for the good photo ops. She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit from childhood. But, if I'm honest, it was simpler than that. You didn't fit the narrative. "What narrative is that?" I asked. "The perfect family narrative. Mom and Dad, the proud parents, Mark, the brilliant doctor, me, the social media darling. You were—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Complicated," I suggested. "Exactly." She nodded emphatically. "You were the question mark, the one who didn't slot neatly into the story I was telling. The serious sister with the finance job no one really understood. The one who wasn't seeking approval or validation. The one who just did her own thing." The assessment was surprisingly insightful coming from Danielle, who I had always considered the least self-aware member of our family. "And that didn't work for your brand," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It didn't work for my insecurity," she corrected me. "Having you in the picture meant acknowledging there were different ways to be, different measures of success, different paths that didn't require constant external validation." She looked around the boathouse with its evidence of understated luxury. "I'm starting to think your way might actually be healthier." This admission, from the sister who had built her entire career on cultivating and monetizing attention, was nothing short of astonishing. "The irony," I said gently, "is that I would have welcomed being included, not as a prop in your perfect family tableau, but as the sister who had chosen a different path but was still valued." Danielle winced. "That's the part that makes me feel awful. I didn't exclude you because I didn't love you. I excluded you because I didn't know how to incorporate someone who wasn't playing the same game as the rest of us." "And what game is that?" "The approval game. The please love me game." She sighed, running a hand through her expertly highlighted hair. "You've never played it, have you?" "Not really. Even when you were getting straight A's or helping with everything, it wasn't about getting their approval. It was about doing what you believed was right." I considered this, thinking back to my childhood, the years of quiet achievement and unrecognized effort. I wanted their approval, I admitted. I just learned early that it wasn't forthcoming, no matter what I did, so I found other sources of validation. Teachers who recognized my abilities, mentors who valued my work ethic, eventually clients who trusted my judgment. Danielle nodded slowly. "That's what I never developed, the ability to validate myself. I'm still that little girl doing pirouettes and constantly checking to see if Dad is watching." The vulnerability in her voice touched me. Despite our differences, despite the years of feeling sidelined by her effortless ability to command attention, I recognized the insecurity beneath her polished exterior. In her own way, she had been shaped by our family dynamics just as profoundly as I had. "It's not too late to learn," I told her. To find worth in yourself that doesn't depend on likes or followers or even family approval. Is that what you did? She asked. When you went to London? It's what I've been doing my whole life, I said. London just accelerated the process, removed me from the old patterns long enough to see them clearly, to build something entirely my own. Danielle studied me with newfound respect. You're kind of amazing, you know that? All this time I thought you were just ordinary, the sensible sister with the boring job. But you've been quietly extraordinary while the rest of us were making noise to prove we mattered. The compliment warmed me, not because I needed her admiration, but because it represented a genuine shift in perspective. Danielle had always been the beauty of the family, the one whose charm and vivacity drew people to her like moths to flame. Her attention had never lingered long on me, slipping past to more interesting prospects with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the center of every room. We've all been extraordinary in different ways, I said diplomatically. Just because my path has been quieter doesn't make it more or less valid than yours. But that's exactly what we did to you, she insisted. Treated your path as less valid, less interesting, less worthy of attention. She shook her head, frustrated with herself. God, no wonder you bought a mansion and waited for the perfect moment to reveal it. Talk about a power move. I smiled despite myself. It wasn't about power, at least not in the way you mean. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, showing myself, and yes, all of you, that I had built something substantial while no one was watching. The conversation shifted then, moving into lighter territory. Danielle asked about London, about my favorite restaurants and shopping districts, about the differences between British and American business culture. I found myself sharing stories I had never told my family, the challenges of establishing credibility in a male-dominated industry, the thrill of closing my first major deal, the gradual accumulation of confidence that came with each success. When we finally left the boathouse, the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the lake. Danielle linked her arm through mine as we walked back to the house, a gesture of casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable before this week. We should do this again, she said as we reached the terrace. Not just the reunion, but talking, actually talking. I'd like that, I replied, surprised to find I meant it. That evening, I had arranged for a local chef to prepare an authentic New England clam bake on the beach. Lanterns were strung between trees, tables set with simple linen and wildflowers. The casual elegance created exactly the atmosphere I had envisioned, familial but elevated, relaxed but thoughtful. As twilight deepened into night, conversations flowed more easily than they had in years. Family stories were shared, old jokes revisited, new connections formed. I moved among the tables, making sure everyone had what they needed, observing the subtly shifting dynamics with quiet satisfaction. My father caught me as I was checking on the dessert preparation, drawing me aside with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "Jessica," he began, "I've been wanting to speak with you privately." He gestured toward the dock. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" We strolled to the end of the wooden pier, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading behind us. The night was perfect, stars emerging in a clear sky, the air warm with just a hint of coolness off the water. My father seemed uncertain how to begin, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the dark lake. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he finally said, "about patterns, about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a family, as people." I waited, giving him space to find his way through what was clearly a difficult conversation. The story I told myself about you was that you were the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need the spotlight because you were secure without it. He shook his head. It was a convenient narrative. It let me focus on Mark's insecurities, on Danielle's need for constant reassurance. It let me off the hook for giving you the attention and recognition you deserved. The admission was delivered with a simplicity that lent it weight. My father had always been a proud man, more comfortable giving pronouncements than acknowledging mistakes. "Did you know," he continued, "that when you were in high school, my colleagues used to ask about you all the time? Your math teacher would tell me about your exceptional abilities. Your debate coach said you had the most analytical mind he'd encountered in 30 years of teaching. This was news to me. You never mentioned that." "I know." He sighed heavily. I would acknowledge it and then immediately start talking about Mark's football scholarship or Danielle's dance recital. Not because I wasn't proud of you, but because their achievements were the ones I understood. The ones that reflected the values I was raised with. I considered this perspective, seeing for the first time how my father's own upbringing might have shaped his response to his children. He had been raised in a traditional household where athletic prowess and social charm were prized above intellectual pursuits or quiet competence. "Your grandfather," he said, as if reading my thoughts, "never saw the point of book learning beyond what was necessary for a decent job. Success to him meant physical strength, popularity, things you could see and measure in trophies or applause." "And I didn't provide those visible markers," I observed. "No. Your gifts were subtler, your victories less obvious." He turned to face me directly. "But that's no excuse for not making the effort to see you clearly, for not challenging the limitations of my own perspective." The dock swayed gently beneath us as a night breeze rippled across the water. In the distance, a loon called, its haunting cry echoing across the lake. "I went into your study yesterday," my father admitted. "I hope you don't mind. The door was open and I was curious about the books on your shelves." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I found your collection of financial texts, investment, theories, economic histories." He smiled faintly. I started reading one, about value investing principles. I didn't understand most of it, but what struck me was the margin notes in your handwriting. So precise, so insightful. Even I could tell you were engaging with ideas at a level I've never reached in any subject. The idea of my father puzzling through economic theory was both touching and slightly amusing. He had always been more comfortable with concrete facts than abstract principles. "What I'm trying to say," he continued, "is that I'm seeing you now. Really seeing you. Not just the wealth or the success, but the mind behind it. The person you've always been, if I had bothered to look properly." The words I had longed to hear for decades should have felt more triumphant. Instead, they brought a complicated mix of emotions. Gratification, certainly, but also a wistfulness for all the years when such recognition might have meant everything to a younger Jessica. "Thank you for that," I said simply. "It matters, even now." "I wish I could go back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Give you the basement to your brother for once. Actually read those essays you worked so hard on. Celebrate your scholarship. To Cornell the way we celebrated Mark's football trophies." "We can't change the past," I told him, "but we can choose how we move forward." He nodded, clearing his throat. "Your mother and I have been talking. We want to do better, be better. Not just because of all this." He gestured toward the magnificent estate. "But because you deserve it. Always have." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Whether this change of heart would translate into lasting behavioral change remained to be seen. But the acknowledgement itself represented a shift I had once thought impossible. "I'd like that," I said. "But it will take time. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight." "I know." He hesitated, then awkwardly reached out to pat my shoulder, the closest he had come to a physical demonstration of affection in years. "You've built an extraordinary life, Jessica. I hope there's room in it for a father who's trying to make amends." We walked back to the party together, rejoining the family gathering that now seemed subtly different, not dramatically transformed, but shifted. In ways that felt meaningful. My mother caught my eye from across the beach, her smile questioning. I nodded slightly, letting her know the conversation had gone well. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, the clam bake giving way to dessert and coffee around the fire pit. Someone produced a guitar, and my Uncle David played folk songs from our childhood, voices joining in with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill. In the warm glow of firelight, surrounded by family members who were seeing me with new eyes, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. Later, as guests began drifting back to the house, my cousin Lisa fell into step beside me. We had been close as children, before the teenage years drew us in different directions. She toward the social butterfly path that Danielle would later perfect, me toward academics and achievement. "This whole week has been eye-opening," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Watching how your parents are with you now. So careful, so attentive, almost afraid." "Afraid?" I repeated, surprised by her choice of word. She nodded. "Afraid of getting it wrong again. Afraid of missing something important about you." She glanced sideways at me. "Were they really that bad? When we were growing up?" The question gave me pause. How to explain decades of subtle dismissal, of being overlooked in favor of siblings whose achievements fit more neatly into conventional ideas of success? How to convey the cumulative effect of always being the one relegated to the basement, physically and metaphorically? "They weren't cruel," I said finally. "Just consistently inattentive to what mattered to me. Consistently prioritizing my siblings' needs and accomplishments over mine." Lisa nodded slowly. "I remember now. How at family gatherings, Uncle Thomas would go on and on about Mark's football games or Danielle's performances, but when someone asked about you, he'd just say, 'Jessica's doing fine in school,' and change the subject." The memory stung, even now. Those exact words, "doing fine in school," had been my father's standard response when relatives inquired about me, regardless of whether I had just won a major academic competition or been selected for a prestigious program. "I think I participated in that too," Lisa admitted. "Not asking more, not really seeing you. It was like there was this family script about who each of you was, and we all just followed it without questioning." "The quiet middle child," I said. "The sensible one. The one who helps in the kitchen while the others entertain." "Exactly." She looked around at the magnificent estate, shaking her head in wonder. "And all this time, you were actually the most driven, the most ambitious, the most successful." "Not necessarily the most," I corrected her. "Just successful in ways that weren't valued or recognized within our family system." We had reached the house, its windows glowing warmly against the night. Guests were gathering in the great room. For after-dinner drinks, the murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. "Well, they certainly recognize it now," Lisa observed with a small smile. "Nothing like a multi-million-dollar estate to make people reevaluate their assumptions." There was no malice in her tone, just a pragmatic acknowledgement of human nature. People's perception of worth is often influenced by tangible markers of success, by visible proof of value. The lake house provided that proof in a way that my quiet achievements never could. As the evening wound down, I found myself once again in the role of hostess, ensuring everyone had what they needed for a comfortable night. It was a familiar position. Taking care of others' needs had been my default mode for as long as I could remember. The difference now was that it came from a place of choice rather than obligation, from generosity rather than a desperate attempt to prove my worth. When the last guest had retired and the staff had completed their evening tasks, I made my way to the master suite. The expansive room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, represented everything my basement accommodations had not: space, light, consideration, value. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the moonlight create a silver path across the dark water. The house was quiet now, my family sleeping in the comfortable beds I had provided, surrounded by the luxury I had created. This was the victory I had imagined during those nights on the pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling pipes while laughter echoed from above. Not just the material success, but the reclamation of dignity, the quiet assertion of worth that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Yet, as I prepared for bed, I found myself contemplating not the conclusion of a revenge narrative, but the beginning of something more nuanced. The relationships within my family were shifting, old patterns disrupted by the undeniable reality of who I had become. These changes were tentative, imperfect, shaped by decades of established dynamics that wouldn't disappear overnight. But they were changes nonetheless. Small fissures in the foundations of assumptions that had defined my place in the family hierarchy. Whether these fissures would widen into lasting transformation remained to be seen, but the possibility itself represented a kind of victory I hadn't anticipated. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that the true power of the lake house wasn't in the shock value of its reveal or the luxury it represented. The power lay in its role as a physical manifestation of my inner journey, from the forgotten daughter, in the basement, to a woman who had built something substantial entirely on her own terms. The girl who had once been invisible was now impossible to overlook. Not because she demanded attention or sought validation, but because she had become so completely herself that the world had no choice but to see her clearly. And that, perhaps, was the most meaningful transformation of all. The 5th day of the reunion dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer morning that seemed almost deliberately crafted for the next phase of my carefully orchestrated week. I had planned a boat tour of Lake Warramog for the entire family, with lunch at a private cove accessible only by water. As I went through my morning routine, I couldn't help but reflect on how differently I moved through the world now compared to the timid, approval-seeking young woman I had once been. My ensuite bathroom, with its marble surfaces and rainfall shower, was larger than the entire basement I'd been relegated to during family gatherings. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I had expanded into spaces, both physical and psychological, that my family had never imagined I could occupy. At breakfast, I noticed a subtle shift in the way my relatives interacted with me. The initial shock of my success had evolved into something more nuanced. Some, like my father and siblings, were making genuine efforts to connect, asking thoughtful questions about my work and life in London. Others had moved into a kind of performative deference, their conversation peppered with transparent attempts to establish common ground or shared interests that had never concerned them before. "Jessica," my Aunt Patricia said as I poured my coffee, "I've been thinking about investing in some property myself. Nothing like this, of course," she gestured around the magnificent kitchen, "but perhaps a small rental. I'd love your advice." This was the same aunt who, at past gatherings, had barely acknowledged my career, dismissing finance as all that boring money stuff, while lavishing attention on Mark's medical anecdotes or Danielle's social media achievements. Now she was looking at me with eager attentiveness, as if my opinions on real estate had suddenly become fascinating. "I'd be happy to discuss it," I replied evenly. "Though real estate investments can be quite complex, it's not something I'd recommend without careful consideration of your overall financial picture." She nodded eagerly. "Oh, of course. So thoughtful, so thorough. You always were the smart one, weren't you?" The revision of history was almost amusing. In family lore, I had never been the smart one, merely the reliable one, the practical one, the one who helped behind the scenes while others claimed the spotlight. Throughout breakfast, similar interactions played out with various relatives. Uncle Robert suddenly recalled how he'd always said Jessica would go far, conveniently forgetting his dismissal of my Cornell scholarship as book smarts without real-world application. Cousin Jeremy, who had never shown the slightest interest in my career, now wanted detailed advice on his 401k options. I navigated these conversations with polite detachment, neither rejecting their newfound interest nor fully embracing it. Years in finance had taught me to evaluate motivations. to distinguish between genuine engagement and opportunistic positioning. Most of these overtures fell decidedly into the latter category. After breakfast, we gathered at the dock where the vintage wooden Riva Aquarama I had purchased during the estate sale awaited. The gleaming mahogany craft, with its distinctive blue and white upholstery, was a masterpiece of Italian design, elegant, powerful, and understated in exactly the way I had come to value in my possessions. "This boat is incredible," Mark said, running an appreciative hand along the polished hull. "Must have cost a fortune." "It was part of the estate," I explained. "The Whitcombs had it custom-built in 1968. I had it fully restored last year." "Of course you did," he replied with a small smile. "Proper stewardship of valuable assets. Very you." There was no mockery in his tone, just a genuine observation. That suggested he was beginning to see me more clearly than he ever had before. As everyone boarded, I took the helm, another subtle departure from family tradition. In the past, my father or Mark would automatically assume control of any vehicle, any situation, any decision requiring authority. Today, no one questioned my position at the controls, my knowledge of the lake's geography, my carefully planned itinerary. We cruised slowly around the lake's perimeter, the Riva's engines purring with well-maintained power. I pointed out historics, properties, shared anecdotes about the lake's development, revealed my knowledge of local history that I had studiously acquired since purchasing the estate. My family listened with interest, occasionally asking questions or expressing admiration for particularly impressive homes. "Did you know?" I told them as we passed a stately Victorian with a distinctive turret. "That house was built by a woman." Elizabeth Carter inherited her father's lumber fortune in 1892 and designed the entire property herself, despite having no formal architectural training. The locals were scandalized, not just by a woman building such a grand home, but by her insistence on including modern conveniences like electricity and indoor plumbing when most of the lake houses were still using gas lamps and outhouses. "A woman ahead of her time," my mother observed. "She was," I agreed. "The Historical Society has her journals. She wrote about the satisfaction of creating spaces that reflected her vision rather than conforming to others' expectations." The parallel wasn't lost on my more perceptive relatives. My father caught my eye, a flash of understanding passing between us. By midday, we reached the private cove I had selected for our lunch. A small sandy beach gave way to a grassy clearing surrounded by ancient pines. Staff from the house had arrived earlier by the service boat, setting up an elegant picnic under a white canopy. Everything had been arranged with careful attention to detail: comfortable seating, chilled wine, a menu featuring locally sourced ingredients prepared by the private chef I had engaged for the week. As my family disembarked, exclaiming over the beautiful setting and impressive spread, I remained briefly on the boat, taking a moment to observe them from a slight distance. This vantage point had become familiar and oddly comfortable. Close, enough to engage but removed enough to maintain perspective. My mother noticed my hesitation and turned back, extending her hand toward me. "Jessica," she called, "aren't you coming? This is all because of you, after all." The gesture was small but meaningful. Throughout my childhood, it had always been me watching from the periphery, me stepping in when needed but rarely being actively included. This simple act of turning back, of acknowledging my central role, represented the kind of recognition I had so often been denied. I took her offered hand as I stepped onto the beach, allowing this moment of connection without over-investing it. With significance. 1 week of changed behavior couldn't erase decades of patterns, but it could perhaps mark the beginning of something different. Lunch was a leisurely affair, the conversation flowing more naturally than it had in years. Whether because of the idyllic setting, the excellent food and wine, or the gradually evolving family dynamic, the usual hierarchies and tensions seemed temporarily suspended. Even Danielle, typically focused on documenting every moment for her followers, kept her phone tucked away for most of the meal, fully present in a way I rarely witnessed. After dessert was served, my father stood, glass in hand, commanding attention with the easy authority he had always possessed. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his voice carrying across the small gathering. "To Jessica, not just for this magnificent week and all the thought she's put into every detail, but for something more important. For showing us all what quiet excellence looks like." The words hung in the air, unexpected and potent. My father had never been one for emotional speeches or public acknowledgments of mistake. This was new territory. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he continued, "about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a family, about the roles we assign each other without even realizing we're doing it. Jessica was always cast as the supportive one, the practical one, the one who didn't need the spotlight because she was somehow above all that." He looked directly at me, his expression more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "But the truth is, I used that narrative to justify not giving you the recognition you deserved, to excuse putting you in the basement year after year, both literally and figuratively." A hushed silence fell over the group. Family tensions and failures were typically glossed over in our clan, difficult truths smoothed beneath a veneer of selective memory and social nicety. This direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing was unprecedented. "I can't go back and change how we've treated you," my father said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can promise that going forward, there will be no more basements, no more taking you for granted, no more overlooking the quiet excellence that has always been your hallmark." He raised his glass higher. "To Jessica, who built herself a castle while the rest of us weren't paying attention." The toast was met with murmurs of agreement, glasses raising all around. The moment should have felt triumphant, the public acknowledgement I had craved for so long finally delivered in the most dramatic setting imaginable. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, gratification certainly, but also a wistfulness for all the years when such recognition might have healed wounds still forming, rather than addressing scars long hardened. "Thank you," I said simply, raising my own glass in response. "To family, not as we were, but as we might become." The afternoon unfolded in pleasant leisure. Some relatives went swimming in the clear waters of the cove, others explored the surrounding woods on trails I had the foresight to have discreetly marked. I joined a small group, including my mother and aunt, for a walk along the water's edge, collecting smooth stones and interesting driftwood. "I've been meaning to ask," my mother said as we paused to examine a particularly striking piece of water-worn cedar, "about the guest list for this reunion. I noticed you didn't invite the Hendersons or the Clarks." The observation surprised me. The Hendersons and Clarks were distant relatives on my father's side who had been regular fixtures at family gatherings, despite having little meaningful connection to our immediate family. Their presence had always struck me as performative, rather than genuine, an adherence to tradition without purpose or pleasure. "I decided to focus on those who matter most," I replied honestly. "Those with whom we might build real relationships rather than maintain obligatory ones." My mother nodded thoughtfully. "It's better this way, more intimate. The Hendersons always made those awkward political comments, and Janet Clark spent most of every reunion criticizing everyone's life choices while bragging about her children." This candid assessment was unlike my mother, who typically maintained social connections regardless of their quality or value, preserving appearances at all costs. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "this way we get more time with you. That's more important than keeping up traditions for tradition's sake." The simple statement, delivered without drama or excessive emotion, touched me more deeply than my father's elaborate toast. It suggested a genuine reevaluation of priorities rather than a reactive response to my newly discovered success. As the afternoon began transitioning to evening, we returned to the boats for the journey back to the estate. The mood was relaxed. conversations flowing easily as we cruised across the lake, now painted with the golden light of approaching sunset. I noticed Mark sitting quietly at the stern, watching the wake spread behind us in symmetrical patterns. I handed the controls temporarily to the boat's engineer and made my way back to join him. "Penny for your thoughts," I offered, taking the seat beside him. He glanced up, a rueful expression crossing his features. "Just thinking about Dad's toast, about all of this." He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the boat but the entire situation. "It's like we've been living in this family story we all agreed on, and suddenly the whole narrative has been rewritten." The observation was surprisingly insightful coming from Mark, who I had always considered more focused on action than introspection. "Does that bother you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Having the story change?" He considered this for a moment, watching the fading shoreline as we moved across the open water. "Not in the way you might think," he finally said. "It's actually kind of liberating. If your role in the family wasn't what we all thought, maybe mine isn't either. Maybe I don't have to be the golden boy carrying all Dad's expectations for medical greatness." This perspective hadn't occurred to me. I had been so focused on how family patterns had constrained and diminished me that I hadn't fully considered how those same patterns might have limited my siblings in different ways. "What would you be, if not the star surgeon following in the footsteps of Dad's unrealized medical ambitions?" I asked. Mark laughed softly. "That's the thing. I don't know. I've never allowed myself to really consider alternatives." He turned to face me directly. "I'm good at surgery. I save lives. That matters. But there's this weight of always having to be exceptional, always having to justify being the favorite, you know?" I didn't know. Not exactly. My struggle had been the opposite, fighting to be seen at all, rather than living up to outsized expectations. But I could recognize the burden he described, the way family narratives can become prisons regardless of whether they elevate or diminish. "Maybe that's the gift in all this," I suggested. "Not just me reclaiming my place in the family, but all of us having the chance to re-examine the roles we've been playing, to choose what we keep and what we discard." Mark nodded slowly. "I never thought of you as the philosophical one." "There are a lot of things you never thought about me," I pointed out, keeping my tone light to soften the observation. "True enough," he smiled, genuine rather than defensive. "I'm finding there's more depth to all of us than the labels we've been assigned." As we approached the dock of my estate, the house rising majestically before us with lights beginning to glow in the windows against the deepening dusk, I was struck by how differently I viewed it now compared to when I had first made the purchase. Then, it had represented a statement, a tangible manifestation of success that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Now, it felt more like a threshold, a space where old patterns could be examined and perhaps transformed. The evening's entertainment was deliberately low-key after the emotional weight of the day's revelations, a casual dinner on the terrace followed by board games and conversation in the great room. I moved through these activities with a new awareness, observing the subtle shifts in family dynamics with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a familiar yet evolving culture. My cousin Amy's husband, Tim, a quiet man who had always seemed slightly overwhelmed by our family's complicated emotional terrain, sought me out as I was preparing a nightcap at the bar cart. "I just wanted to say," he began hesitantly, "I've always admired how you handle yourself in this family. Even before all this." He gestured around the magnificent room. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious about this perspective from someone who occupied a similar peripheral position in family gatherings. He glanced toward where Amy was engaged in an animated conversation with Danielle, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "You never seemed to need their approval the way everyone else did. You just did your own thing, without the drama or the constant positioning for attention." The observation was astute, though not entirely accurate. I had wanted their approval. Desperately. I had simply learned early that it wasn't forthcoming, no matter what I achieved or contributed. It wasn't always a conscious choice, I admitted. More an adaptation to circumstances. Tim nodded, understanding. Still, it takes a certain strength to remain yourself when no one's really seeing you. The simple validation from this unexpected source, someone who had observed our family dynamics from the margins, as I had experienced them from within, was oddly affecting. There was no agenda in his words, no recalibration based on my newfound status, just a genuine acknowledgement of a quality he had recognized long before the lake house revelation. "Thank you," I said simply. Later that night, after the last guests had retired and the house had fallen silent, I found myself drawn once again to my study. The space had become a sanctuary during the reunion week, a place to retreat, to process, to maintain the equilibrium necessary for navigating the complex emotional currents of family reconciliation. I was surprised to find my mother already there, sitting in one of the leather armchairs by the fireplace, a book open on her lap. She looked up as I entered, offering a small smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I couldn't sleep, and this room has such a peaceful energy." "Not at all," I assured her, moving to pour myself a small whiskey. "Would you like something? Tea? A nightcap?" She shook her head. "Just company, if you're not too tired." I took the chair opposite hers, sinking into its comfortable embrace. For a few moments, we sat in companionable silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. "Your father meant what he said today," she finally offered, "about no more basements." "I believe he did," I acknowledged. "In this moment, at least." My mother's expression grew thoughtful. "You're skeptical. I don't blame you." "Not skeptical." "Exactly. Just realistic about how deeply ingrained family patterns can be. Real change requires more than good intentions in an emotional moment." She nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. You usually are about the things that matter." She closed the book on her lap, running her fingers over its leather cover. "Did you know I used to keep journals about each of you children? Little observations, milestones, things I wanted to remember." This was news to me. My mother had never struck me as particularly reflective or introspective. "I went back and read them recently," she continued, "after your father and I talked about how we'd treated you over the years. I wanted to see if there were clues, signs we should have noticed." "And were there?" I asked, curious despite myself. "So many." Her voice held regret, but not self-pity. "Times when you achieved something remarkable and we barely acknowledged it. Times when you needed support that never came because we were focused elsewhere. Small moments that probably seemed insignificant to us but must have felt like repeated rejections to you. The simple acknowledgement, not just of specific incidents but of the cumulative pattern they created, was unexpectedly powerful. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I had doubted my own perceptions, wondered if I was being oversensitive or demanding and feeling overlooked and undervalued. This confirmation that the pattern had been real, had been documented even, if not recognized, felt like a validation of my lived experience. "What struck me most," my mother continued, "was how your personality seemed to change in the entries. In the early years, you were described as curious, outspoken, eager for recognition, like any child. Then gradually, entry by entry, you became the quiet one, the self-sufficient one, the one who never causes trouble." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "We didn't notice you becoming those things. We just accepted that's who you were without questioning why a bright, engaged child would withdraw into silence." The observation cut to the heart of my experience. Not a natural introversion or inherent self-sufficiency, but an adaptive response to consistent dismissal. The young Jessica had learned that her voice wasn't valued, Her achievements weren't celebrated, her needs weren't prioritized. And so she had stopped expressing them, channeling her energy instead into building a life where external validation wasn't necessary for success or self-worth. "I can't change the past," my mother said softly. "None of us can. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see how we contributed to that transformation, how we made you feel invisible in your own family." The simple acknowledgement delivered, without defensiveness or excessive emotion, reached places within me that my father's more dramatic toast had not. This wasn't a performance for an audience, but a quiet reckoning between mother and daughter. "Thank you for that," I said, my voice steadier than I might have expected. "It means something, to have the reality acknowledged." We sat in silence, for a while longer, the weight of unspoken history hanging between us, not erased but perhaps lightened by this moment of honest recognition. "What was the book?" I asked eventually, nodding toward the volume still in her lap. She glanced down as if surprised to find it there. "Oh, just something from your shelves. A history of financial markets. I was curious about your world." The small gesture, seeking to understand my interests rather than expecting me to conform to familial norms, represented exactly the kind of shift that might, if sustained, begin to heal decades of distance. "It's probably not the most accessible introduction," I noted with a small smile. "I could recommend something more suitable for a beginner." "I'd like that," she said, returning the smile. "I'd like to understand the things that matter to you." As she rose to leave, she paused by my chair, hesitating briefly before leaning down to kiss the top of my head, a maternal gesture so rare in our relationship that it momentarily startled me. "Good night, Jessica," she said softly. "Thank you for creating all of this. Not just the beautiful house and the perfect week, but this chance for us to see each other more clearly." After she left, I remained in the study, nursing my whiskey, reflecting on the day's revelations and conversations. The reunion was unfolding in ways I couldn't have predicted when I orchestrated this elaborate reveal. What had begun as a calculated demonstration of success, a decisive disruption of established family narratives, was evolving into something more nuanced, an opportunity for genuine reassessment of long-established patterns. The sense of vindication I had anticipated was present but muted, overshadowed by more complex emotions. There was a certain poignancy in receiving the recognition and connection I had craved for so long, only after I had learned to thrive without it. The approval that might once have been transformative now felt like a confirmation of a journey, already completed, rather than a validation I still desperately sought. As I finally retired for the night, making my way through the quiet house to the master suite that represented such a stark contrast to my basement accommodations of years past, I found myself contemplating not just how my family was seeing me differently, but how I was seeing them. Behind the roles they had played in our shared narrative, the ambitious father, the accommodating mother, the golden son, the charming daughter, were individuals shaped by their own histories, constraints, and blind spots. This recognition didn't excuse the patterns that had caused such lasting hurt, but it offered a possibility I hadn't fully considered when planning this week. That transformation might be possible not just in how they saw me, but in how we all saw each other. Not a neat resolution to decades of complex dynamics, but perhaps the beginning of more authentic connections based on who we actually were, rather than the roles we had been assigned. The basement girl would always be part of me. That watchful, resilient child who learned to create her own validation when external recognition wasn't forthcoming. But she was no longer the whole of my identity. She had grown into a woman who could claim her place without apology, who could acknowledge past hurts without being defined by them, who could perhaps even begin to forge new kinds of connections with the family that had once overlooked her. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself looking forward to the remaining days of the reunion with curiosity rather than calculation. The script I had imagined for this week, the dramatic reveal, the stunned recognition, the belated validation, had played out as planned. But what was emerging beyond that initial act was something I hadn't fully anticipated. The possibility of genuine evolution in relationships I had long ago resigned to permanent patterns. The lake house had achieved its purpose as a statement, a tangible manifestation of success that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But perhaps its greater value lay in creating a neutral territory where new interactions could unfold, where carefully constructed family narratives could be examined, and perhaps rewritten, not just my role but all of ours. The basement was behind me, literally and figuratively. What lay ahead was not revenge or vindication, but something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. The possibility of belonging, not as the overlooked middle child or the successful prodigal daughter, but simply as myself. Complex, accomplished, worthy of recognition not for what I had achieved, but for who I had always been. On the morning of the 6th day, I woke before sunrise and made my way to the private dock extending into the still waters of Lake Waramog. The air was crisp with early summer coolness, the lake surface a perfect mirror reflecting the fading stars and lightening sky. I sat at the edge, feet dangling above the water, and watched as the first golden rays broke over the distant hills. This moment of solitude felt necessary after days of constant family interaction. Despite the positive shifts in our dynamics, the emotional labor of navigating these evolving relationships had taken its toll. Here, alone with the awakening day, I could simply be. Not the forgotten daughter seeking recognition, not the successful financier making a statement, just Jessica in the quiet morning. I heard footsteps on the dock behind me and turned to find Danielle approaching, wrapped in a cashmere throw, her hair tousled from sleep. Without her usual careful styling and makeup, she looked younger, more vulnerable, closer to the little sister I remembered from childhood than the polished influencer she had become. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, settling beside me. "I'm always up early," I replied. "It's when I do my best thinking." She nodded, pulling the throw tighter around her shoulders. "I never knew that about you. There's a lot I never knew, I guess." We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the day brightened around us, the lake gradually revealing its colors, deep blues shifting to greens near the shoreline, the surrounding forest emerging from darkness into vibrant summer foliage. "I've been wondering," Danielle said eventually, "what happens after this week, when we all go back to our regular lives? Will we just fall into the old patterns again?" The question had been circling in my own mind. Family dynamics are deeply ingrained, reinforced by decades of interaction. A week of changed behavior, prompted by the dramatic revelation of my success, didn't necessarily indicate lasting transformation. That depends on whether this week has been about appearances or something deeper, I said honestly. Whether the changes we've seen are reactions to my financial status or genuine recognition of long-standing patterns that need to change. Danielle considered this, absently twisting a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit from childhood that her carefully constructed adult persona usually suppressed. "It's both, isn't it?" she finally offered. "The shock of what you've achieved opened the door, but what's happening now feels more real." Her perception surprised me. Danielle had always struck me as the least self-aware member of our family, focused on external validation and carefully curated appearances. Yet here she was, acknowledging the complex reality beneath the surface changes. "I think what scares me," she continued, "is how easily we all accepted the roles we were given. How I never questioned why you were always put in the basement, or why your achievements were treated as less important than mine or Mark's. We were children," I reminded her. "We didn't create those patterns." "No, but I perpetuated them." She turned to face me fully, her expression unusually serious. "Even as adults, even when I should have known better. Do you know how many family photos I've posted over the years where you're barely visible in the background? Or not included at all? The observation stung, even now. Those carefully composed images shared with thousands of followers had reinforced my peripheral position in the family narrative, broadcasting our dysfunction under the guise of perfect moments. "I've been going through my social accounts this week," Danielle admitted, "looking at how I've represented our family. It's not great, Jess. There's this whole storyline I created about the Walsh family that basically erased you." The acknowledgement was unexpectedly powerful, not a dramatic apology like my father's, but a simple recognition of a pattern previously unexamined. "What would you do differently?" I asked, curious about her perspective now that awareness had dawned. She thought for a moment. "I'd be more honest, I think. Less worried about the perfect family image and more focused on authentic connection." A small, self-deprecating smile crossed her features. "Though I'm not sure my followers would appreciate the real Walsh family drama." "Maybe authenticity has its own appeal," I suggested. Danielle laughed softly. "Maybe. It's certainly less exhausting than maintaining the perfect facade." As the sun cleared the horizon, casting long golden rays across the water, I was struck by how this conversation, simple, honest, without agenda, represented exactly the kind of interaction that had been rare in our family. No positioning for attention, no reinforcement of established roles, just two adults sharing perspectives and recognizing patterns. "We should head back," I said eventually. "The hiking guide will be arriving soon for anyone who wants to explore the trails." True to my continuing role as hostess, I had arranged a variety of activities for the day: guided hikes through the woodland property, water sports on the lake, a local artist offering painting lessons on the terrace. As the family gathered for breakfast, the mood was relaxed, conversations flowing easily across generational and familial lines that had often served as boundaries in the past. My father, I noticed, was making a particular effort to engage with every family member equally, consciously adjusting his usual pattern of focusing primarily on Mark and Danielle. When my cousin Lisa mentioned an article about financial markets she'd read recently, he turned to me. "Jessica would be the expert on that," he said, creating an opening for me to share my knowledge rather than changing the subject as he might have in the past. These small adjustments, while seemingly insignificant in isolation, represented conscious efforts to disrupt long-standing patterns. Whether they would persist beyond the rarefied atmosphere of the lake house remained to be seen, but their very existence suggested possibilities I hadn't dared imagine when planning this reunion. The day unfolded in pleasant activity, family members choosing different pursuits according to their interests. I moved between groups, ensuring everyone had what they needed, while also allowing myself to fully participate rather than remaining in the observer role I had often occupied at family gatherings. In the late afternoon, as golden light bathed the property in a warm glow, I found myself on the terrace with my father. Most of the family had scattered to rest or change before dinner, leaving us in a rare moment of privacy. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, gazing out over the immaculate grounds toward the lake beyond. "Something that's been on my mind since we arrived." I waited, allowing him to find his way to the question at his own pace. "Why did you do it this way?" he finally asked. "The big reveal, the dramatic moment. You could have told us about your success years ago. Why wait and orchestrate all this?" The question was fair, more insightful than I might have expected from a man who had spent decades overlooking the obvious patterns in his treatment of his children. "Several reasons," I said after considering my response carefully. "Partly because I needed to establish my success on my own terms, without family expectations or evaluations. Partly because I wasn't sure you would truly see it if I simply mentioned a promotion or a good investment." My father nodded slowly, accepting these truths without defensiveness. "And partly to make a point. To ensure we couldn't dismiss or minimize what you've accomplished." "Yes," I acknowledged. "That too." He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. a gesture so familiar from my childhood, often performed in moments of frustration or contemplation. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "We all did. The shock, the reassessment. It was necessary." The simple acknowledgement, not just of my success but of the reason behind my approach to revealing it, suggested a level of self-awareness I hadn't anticipated. My father had always been quick to justify his actions, to reshape narratives, to preserve his self-image as the wise patriarch making the best decisions for his family. It wasn't about punishment, I told him honestly. It was about visibility. About creating a moment where you had no choice but to see me clearly. "I see you now," he said, turning to meet my gaze directly. "Not just the money or the house or any of this." He gestured around at the magnificent estate. "But you, Jessica. The strength it took to build all this while we were looking the other way. The integrity of doing it on your own terms, without seeking our approval. The generosity of sharing it with us now, despite everything." Something in his voice, in the simple directness of his words, reached past my carefully maintained composure. Not a dramatic emotional breakdown, but a moment of genuine connection that acknowledged both the hurt of the past and the possibility of a different future. "That means something," I said softly. "Even now. Even after everything." We stood in companionable silence for a while, watching as the light changed over the lake, the water reflecting the deepening colors of the approaching sunset. Whatever came next, whatever patterns persisted or shifted when we returned to our separate lives, this moment of honest recognition would remain, a foundation for whatever relationship we might build going forward. For the final dinner of the reunion, I had arranged for the chef to prepare each person's favorite meal, a detail I had gathered through careful conversations with family members throughout the week. As everyone settled at the long table on the terrace, expressions of surprise and pleasure rippled through the group as they discovered their personal preferences had been remembered and honored. "How did you know raspberry cheesecake is my favorite?" my Aunt Catherine asked, clearly touched by the thoughtful gesture. "You mentioned it on Tuesday," I replied simply. "When you were telling the story about your 40th birthday." The truth was, I had always been the one who remembered such details, preferences, anniversaries, meaningful stories. Not because I was naturally more considerate than my siblings, but because I had learned early that being useful, being attentive to others' needs was the surest way to secure a place in a family where I was otherwise overlooked. The difference now was that this attentiveness came from choice rather than necessity, from genuine care rather than desperate compensation. I no longer needed to make myself indispensable to justify my presence at the table. As dinner progressed, the conversation turned to future plans: Mark's upcoming medical conference in Tokyo, Danielle's potential collaboration with an ethical fashion brand, my parents' 40th anniversary trip to Italy in the fall. "What about you, Jessica?" my mother asked, a question that would have been rare in past gatherings. "Will you be returning to London soon, or staying in the States for a while?" All eyes turned to me, genuinely interested in my answer. Another subtle shift from family dynamics where my comings and goings had rarely warranted particular attention. "I'll be splitting my time," I explained. "The firm has approved my request to divide my work between London and New York. I'll be establishing a new division focused on sustainable property investments." "So you'll be closer to home," my father observed, the phrase carrying more weight than its simple meaning might suggest. "Closer," I agreed, "but still maintaining my life in London as well. I've built something valuable there, professionally and personally." The clarification was important, not a return to old patterns, not a reabsorption into the family system on its original terms, but a new arrangement that honored both connection and independence. "We'd love to see the London flat sometime," my mother said, the tentative invitation acknowledging my separate life while expressing a desire to be more fully included in it. "I'd like that," I replied, meaning it. Perhaps in the spring, the city is beautiful then. As the evening continued, a thoughtful mood settled over the gathering. The imminent conclusion of our week together prompted reflection on what had transpired and what might follow. The initial shock of my revelation had evolved into something more nuanced, not merely an adjustment to my changed status, but a reconsideration of family patterns long taken for granted. After dessert was served, my cousin Amy raised her glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said, her voice carrying across the terrace. "To Jessica, for bringing us together in this beautiful place, and for showing us that sometimes the quiet ones are simply taking notes and making plans." Laughter rippled through the group, appreciative rather than mocking. As glasses were raised and murmurs of agreement circulated, I felt a sense of acceptance that went beyond the external trappings of success. My family was seeing me, not just the lake house or the financial achievements, but the person I had become while they weren't paying attention. Later, as the evening wound down and family members began drifting toward their rooms for the final night of the reunion, I found myself, once again at the dock, drawn to the peaceful solitude of the lake at night. The water was still, reflecting the nearly full moon and scattered stars in a perfect mirror image that blurred the boundary between sky and lake. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Mark approaching. He settled beside me on the bench, at the end of the dock, both of us gazing out over the tranquil scene. "Remember when we were kids?" he said after a comfortable silence. "And Dad would take us fishing at dawn? How the lake would look just like this. So still you could see, every star reflected perfectly." The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. Rare early mornings when my father would wake us before sunrise, the 3 children bundled into the car with fishing gear and thermoses of hot chocolate. Those outings had been among the few family activities where I had felt fully included, my gender and quiet nature no impediment to participation. "I remember," I said. "Those were good days." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier this week, about all of us examining the roles we've been playing in this family, choosing what to keep and what to discard." "And?" I prompted when he paused. "And I want to keep this," he said simply, gesturing between us. "The ability to talk like adults, to see each other clearly, to be siblings without all the competition and positioning that defined us growing up." The offer was sincere, I could tell. Not a performative gesture for an audience of relatives, but a genuine desire for a relationship based on mutual respect rather than established hierarchy. "I'd like that," I told him. We sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the gentle lapping of water against the dock the only sound in the still night. No dramatic declarations, no tearful reconciliations, just the quiet acknowledgement of possibility between 2 adults who had spent decades viewing each other through the distorting lens of family roles and expectations. As I prepared for bed that final night, I found myself reflecting on the week as a whole. The revenge fantasy I had initially harbored, the imagined satisfaction of seeing my family stunned by my success, forced to reckon with their years of dismissal, had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more valuable. Yes, there had been a certain vindication in their shocked expressions when they first saw the lake house, in their gradual realization of the success I had built while they weren't looking. But the deeper satisfaction came from the shifts that followed that initial reveal, the conversations that acknowledged long-established patterns, the small adjustments in interaction that suggested the possibility of change, the moments of genuine connection that transcended old roles and resentments. The basement girl hadn't disappeared. She remained a part of me, that watchful, resilient child who learned to create her own validation when external recognition wasn't forthcoming. But she was no longer the whole of my identity. She had grown into a woman who could claim her place. Without apology, who could acknowledge past hurts without being defined by them? Who could forge new connections with the family that had once overlooked her? As I drifted toward sleep in the master suite that stood in such stark contrast to my basement accommodations of years past, I felt a sense of completion. Not the dramatic conclusion of a revenge narrative, but the quieter satisfaction of reclamation, of my story, my worth, my place not just in my family but in the world I had built for myself. The lake house had served its purpose, not merely as a statement of success that couldn't be ignored, but as neutral territory where new patterns could emerge, where old wounds could begin to heal, where the possibility of more authentic relationships could take root. Tomorrow, my family would depart. We would return to our separate lives, carrying with us the experiences and insights of this unprecedented week. Whether the changes we had glimpsed would persist remained to be seen. Family dynamics don't transform overnight, and patterns established over decades don't disappear with a single revelation, no matter how dramatic. But something had shifted, subtly but significantly. A door had opened to possibilities that hadn't existed before. Not just my family seeing me differently, but all of us seeing each other more clearly, beyond the roles and expectations that had defined us for so long. The basement was behind me, literally and figuratively. What lay ahead was not revenge or vindication, but something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. The possibility of belonging, not as the overlooked middle child or the successful prodigal daughter, but simply as myself. Complex, accomplished, worthy of recognition not for what I had achieved, but for who I had always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.